Hi, this is Steve Hall. Thanks for joining us in the fifth of our Veritas video series. Today I want us to take just a few moments to think about what I call sources of authority. The idea is every one of us has to make lots of decisions and many moral decisions. And when we make these decisions, whether we realize it or not, there's some source of authority in our lives somewhere that leads us, encourages us to make the decision we're making. Sometimes it's a combination. But we're more likely to make better decisions if we think clearly about what really is moving us to make the decision we're making. What is our source of authority for any particular decision? So what I want us to do is look at some of the common sources of authority that seem to influence people in making decisions. And I'm thinking especially about moral decisions. And I think you'll agree with me that these are pretty common. As always, I would encourage you to pause the video from time to time and discuss a particular source of authority and maybe ways that it could be misused. So, for example, there are people who make decisions based on what comes out of Hollywood. Sometimes movies can really affect the way we make decisions. The problem with movies is that you can have people engaged in behavior that in real life would lead to disastrous consequences, but whoever's writing the movie can make the consequences turn out to be just great. It's not real life, and that can be a problem. Another source of authority is a songwriter. A lot of people are influenced to make decisions based on the music that they're listening to, and sometimes that can be not so bad, and sometimes it can be horrific. Another common source of authority is our friends. Often when we're trying to make a decision, we talk to friends, and friends help us make a decision. Sometimes they have good advice, sometimes they have bad advice, but we need to think about where they're coming from. Some of us make decisions based on what the experts say. Of course, the problem is sometimes a person is an expert in one area, but he's not much of an expert in another area. And many times, so-called experts want to make pronouncements on things that they don't really know much about, but they think they do. Be careful. Sometimes we look to books to help us make decisions. And, of course, this is related to the authority of experts. But sometimes books can be correct and helpful, and sometimes they can be not so helpful. Many people have learned to use their logic, and they've learned to trust their logic. And logic can be wonderful. It's a wonderful thinking tool. But sometimes our logic lets us down. And many times in life we make what we think is a very logical decision only to look back later on and realize, whoa, that was not very good logic. So be careful with logic. A lot of people are what we call pragmatists. They make decisions based on their personal experience. And they kind of go through life and they try to learn from one experience to the next what works and what doesn't work. And so if they did something in the past that seemed to work, they're more likely to do that again and maybe even encourage other people to do it. There's a problem with this too, because some things seem to work in the short range, but in the long range, they're disastrous. Let me ask you a question here to help you think that one through. Have you ever known anybody who is a chronic liar? I'm sure you have. They're all around us. How did that come to pass? Well, most likely, when they were young, they told a lie, and it helped them escape a consequence. They got by with something by lying about it. And their mind says, okay, I've got a way to live here. This works for me. And if I get myself in trouble, I can lie and get myself out of trouble. And, of course, they assume that people think they're telling the truth. But you know they're not telling the truth. You know they're a chronic liar. How does that happen? Well, it happens because lying just doesn't really work very well in the long run. It may work on one particular occasion, but after a while, it's hard to keep up with lying. And so we get caught, and we're found out. And people begin to realize they can't trust us because we lie too much. We think we're getting by. They may not tell us they can't trust us, but in truth, we're not getting by. And experience, pragmatism, can mislead us, especially when it comes to long-range consequences. A whole lot of people make decisions based on emotions. This is the idea that it can't be wrong, can it? It feels so right. And again, the long-range consequences can betray what we thought was a great decision based on emotion. You may have heard of James Dobson. He was asked one time to write a book, and he wrote a book of several hundred pages entitled Emotions. Can you trust them? And later, as he was talking about that book, he said, I wrote several hundred pages to say what I could have said in one word. No. No. We cannot trust our emotions. Inevitably, they lead us to make bad decisions. Well, the final source of authority I'm going to mention here is the Bible. Now, you have to use discernment when you try to use the Bible as your source of authority, because, of course, there are some people who interpret parts of the Bible differently from others. So we have to learn to do careful Bible study, and this happens over a period of years. It takes time to make sure we're not misinterpreting it. Sometimes it's really helpful to have other Christians in our lives who've maybe had more years of Bible study than we have, who can help us think it through and understand it. Mentors. I believe that's one reason God says there's safety in a multitude of counselors. That's in Proverbs chapter 24, verse 6. But getting wisdom from counselors, even though it's wonderful and it's good and it's a biblical principle, does not excuse us from doing careful Bible study ourselves. I need to learn how to dig into God's Word and figure out what God's saying. So you won't be surprised to hear me say that I believe the Bible is the best source of authority for making decisions. But, of course, many people question, can I trust the Bible? Is it really trustworthy? And we're going to be spending upcoming video time discussing that very question and answering it, I hope, in a way that will give you great confidence in the Scriptures.